They replaced my seat with a trash can and taped my name to it like it belonged there. I stood at the entrance of the reception hall, holding my purse a little tighter than usual, staring at the round table set for 8. Crystal glasses catching the soft golden light, white linen pressed to perfection, and right between 2 elegant chairs, a small silver trash can with a folded place card that read Margaret Whitmore. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake, something a distracted wedding planner would rush to fix with an apology, but then I heard the laughter, low at first, then spreading like a ripple across the table, and when I looked up, Olivia was already watching me, her smile polished and bright, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Margaret," she said lightly, as if we were sharing a private joke. "It's just a little humor. Don't be so dramatic." And a few guests chuckled as if she had given them permission to do so. I felt the room tilt for just a second, not from weakness, but from the sudden clarity of what I was seeing. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, adjusting his cufflinks, not looking at me, not stepping forward, not saying a word. The same boy who once cried when he scraped his knee now couldn't meet his mother's eyes, and I realized then that this moment, this small, cruel detail placed so carefully in the middle of a celebration, wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't harmless. It was intentional, designed to shrink me, to make me smaller in a room where I had once been the center of everything. I took a slow breath and smoothed the front of my navy dress, the one I had chosen weeks ago, because my late husband used to say it made me look like I belonged anywhere. I had imagined this day differently, sitting beside family, watching my son start a new chapter, feeling proud, included. But instead I stood there, looking at a trash can where my seat should have been, and strangely, I didn't feel the urge to argue or cry or defend myself. I felt something colder, steadier, something that had been quietly waiting beneath years of compromise and silence. Because in that moment, as Olivia laughed and the music played softly in the background, I remembered something my husband had told me not long before he passed, his voice calm, certain. "No matter what happens, Margaret, you will never be powerless." And standing there, with my name taped to something meant to be discarded, I finally understood what he meant, so I didn't touch the chair. I didn't acknowledge the joke. I simply looked at it for a second longer, then turned and walked out of the reception without a word, leaving behind the laughter, the music, and the version of myself they thought they could reduce to nothing. I did not go home right away that night. Instead, I sat in my car in the parking lot across the street from the venue, watching the soft glow of the reception lights through the tall glass windows, the silhouettes of people moving, laughing, celebrating, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if a mother had not just been quietly erased from her own son's wedding. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and noticed they were not shaking, which surprised me, because 10 years ago, even 5, I might have cried, might have replayed every second over and over again, asking myself what I had done wrong. But now there was only a stillness, a kind of calm that felt unfamiliar. I could still hear Olivia's voice in my head, light and careless. "Do not be so dramatic." And Daniel standing there, silent, as if silence was easier than choosing a side. I let out a slow breath and leaned back against the seat, the leather cool against my shoulders. And I thought about how this had not started tonight. It had been building, quietly, piece by piece. The missed phone calls, the invitations that never came, the way decisions were made without me and then presented as if I should be grateful just to be informed. I remembered a dinner 6 months ago when Olivia had laughed about how simplifying family dynamics made everything easier, and I had smiled politely, not realizing I was the complication she was referring to. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small envelope I had brought as a wedding gift, still sealed, my handwriting neat and careful on the front, Daniel and Olivia. The weight of it felt different now, not just paper and ink, but something more final. I placed it on the passenger seat and looked at it for a long moment before turning my gaze back to the building. The music swelled faintly even through the closed windows, something soft and romantic, and I wondered if they were dancing yet, if Olivia was smiling that same perfect smile, if Daniel was finally looking at her the way he used to look at me when he was a boy, asking if everything would be all right. I closed my eyes briefly and saw my husband as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. The way he used to tap the steering wheel when he was thinking, the way he always seemed to understand things before I did. "Pay attention," he would say gently, not as a warning, But as a kind of protection, I opened my eyes again and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. The number was still there, unchanged. I hesitated for only a second before pressing it. The line rang twice. Before a familiar voice answered, steady and professional. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, because while they were inside celebrating, convinced they had reduced me to something disposable, I was beginning to understand that I had been looking at the wrong seat all along, and that the place I truly held in this family, in this life, was not something they could take away with a joke or a piece of tape. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Harold Bennett, my husband's attorney for over 30 years, a man who had handled every document, every signature, every quiet decision that built the life Daniel now took for granted. And when he said my name, there was a pause, not out of confusion, but recognition, as if he already understood that something had shifted. I told him I needed to review everything. Not tomorrow, not next week, but as soon as possible, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply said he would clear his morning schedule and that I should bring any documents I still had. When I ended the call, I sat there for another minute, letting the weight of that simple action settle into place, because it was the first decision I had made in a long time that was entirely mine, not shaped by obligation or softened to keep peace. The drive home took 15 minutes, the same route I had taken for decades, but it felt different now, quieter, as if the streets themselves were waiting for something to change. When I stepped into the house, the silence greeted me in a way it had not before, not empty, but steady, the way it used to feel when my husband was still alive, as if the walls held memory rather than absence. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and set the unopened envelope beside it, then walked slowly through each room, noticing details I had overlooked for years, the framed photos, the worn edge of the dining table where Daniel used to sit as a boy, the soft lamplight in the corner that my husband insisted made the house feel warm. I stopped in front of the hallway closet and opened the top shelf, reaching for the small lockbox I had not touched since. The day after the funeral, my fingers hesitated for just a second before lifting the lid. Inside were documents, neatly organized, everything my husband had insisted I keep, even when I told him I trusted him to handle it all. Trust does not mean you stop understanding, he had said once, almost casually, and now, as I flipped through the papers, I realized he had not just been managing our life. He had been preparing me for a moment like this. Names, accounts, legal structures, things I had signed without fully reading because I believed there would always be time to ask later. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread the documents out in front of me, the clock on the wall ticking softly, steady, unbothered by the shift happening beneath it. For the first time, I did not feel like someone being pushed out. I felt like someone stepping into a room that had always belonged to her. I thought about Olivia's smile, the laughter at the table, the way they had reduced everything I had, given into something disposable, and I did not feel anger, not the kind that burns quickly and fades, but something slower, more deliberate, a clarity that sharpened with each passing second, because they had assumed that what they saw was all there was, that a quiet woman who did not argue must also be a woman without options. And as I carefully placed the documents back into the box, I understood how wrong they were. The next morning was no longer just another day. It was the beginning of something they had never considered. And as I turned off the kitchen light and headed toward the stairs, I knew with certainty that the version of me who had stood in that reception hall would not be the one they would meet again. The next morning, I woke up before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that quiet gray light that comes just before everything begins again. And for a moment, I lay there listening to the silence, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels like space, like possibility. I got out of bed slowly and made my way to the kitchen, starting the coffee the same way I had for years, measuring carefully, pouring water, waiting for the soft hum of the machine. But this time, there was no hesitation in my movements, no second guessing, just a steady rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its certainty. I sat at the table with my cup and the lockbox in front of me, opening it again, reviewing each document with more attention than I ever had before. Names, signatures, account numbers, legal language that once seemed too complicated to question now began to take shape in my mind. Not perfectly, but enough to understand that what had been built over decades was not fragile. It was structured, intentional, Protected, I dressed simply, a light blouse, a dark skirt, nothing that called attention, but everything that felt composed, and by the time I stepped outside, the air was cool, carrying that faint crispness of early morning. The drive to Harold's office took just under 20 minutes, traffic still light, the city not yet fully awake, and when I walked into the building, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile that softened when she recognized my name, as if it still carried a kind of quiet weight. Harold was already waiting, standing as I entered his office, his expression calm, observant, the same way it had always been. "Margaret," he said, gesturing for me to sit, and as I placed the documents on his desk, I noticed how steady my hands were. I told him I wanted to understand everything, not just the basics, not just what was convenient, but every detail that mattered. He nodded once, not surprised, not rushed, and began to go through the papers one by one, explaining in a measured tone, clarifying what had been arranged, what was held in trust, what required authorization, what could not be altered without my consent. And with each explanation, something settled deeper inside me, not shock, not excitement, but recognition, as if I was finally catching up to a conversation that had been happening around me for years. There were safeguards I had never asked about, decisions made with foresight I had not fully appreciated. And as Harold spoke, I remembered the evenings my husband would sit at the dining table, papers spread out, asking me to sign here, initial there, always with a gentle reassurance that everything was in order. I had believed him, but I had not understood the extent of what he meant. "You are the primary authority on several of these accounts," Harold said at one point, looking directly at me, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything Olivia had said the night before. I asked questions, more than I had ever asked before, and he answered each one without hesitation. And by the time the meeting ended, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt aligned, as if the pieces of something long neglected had finally been placed back into position. When I stepped out of the office, the sun was higher now, the streets busier, people moving with purpose, and I paused for just a second before heading to my car, taking in the warmth of the light on my face, because for the first time in a very long while, I was not reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next. And that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything. When I got back into my car, I did not start the engine right away. I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting everything Harold had explained settle into something solid, something real, because for the first time, I was not guessing about my place in this family. I knew it, clearly and without doubt. The drive home felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because my thoughts were no longer circling the same questions. They were moving forward, step by step. When I walked into the house, I did not go to the kitchen or the living room. I went straight to the small desk in the corner of the study, the one my husband used to sit at every evening. I opened the drawer and took out a notepad, something simple, lined, and I began to write. Not emotions, not memories, but decisions. I wrote down the accounts Harold had mentioned, the names attached to them, the permissions that required my signature, the ones that could be paused, reviewed, or redirected. I wrote slowly, carefully, making sure each word was clear, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about understanding the structure I had been standing on all along, and how easily others had assumed it belonged to them. I thought about Daniel, about the way he had avoided my eyes, and I did not feel the same ache I had felt the night before. I felt distance, not anger, just a quiet separation that had been forming for longer than I had admitted. Olivia's voice echoed faintly in my memory, light, dismissive, certain of her control, and I realized that certainty had not come from nowhere. It had come from years of small concessions, moments where I chose peace over clarity, where I allowed decisions to pass without question, believing it would keep the family intact. But families do not stay whole because one person remains silent. They stay whole because respect is shared, and somewhere along the way, that balance had shifted without me noticing. I picked up my phone and made 2 calls, the first to my bank, confirming access, asking quiet questions that would have sounded unnecessary just days ago. The second to a financial advisor Harold had recommended, setting an appointment for later that week. Both conversations were calm, professional, nothing dramatic, but each one felt like a door closing behind me and another opening ahead. When I ended the second Call. I placed the phone down gently and looked around the room. The sunlight coming through the window fell across the desk in a way that made everything feel sharper, more defined. And I understood that what had happened at the reception had not diminished me. It had revealed something, not about them, but about how long I had been standing still, waiting for acknowledgement that was never going to come. I stood up and walked back into the kitchen. The unopened envelope still resting where I had left it. I picked it up, weighed it lightly in my hand, then set it aside, not discarded, just no longer urgent, because whatever came next would not be decided by what I had planned to give, but by what I chose to keep. And as I turned toward the window, watching the quiet movement of the street outside, I knew that the next time Daniel looked at me, if he chose to look at me at all, he would not be seeing the same woman who had stood silently in that room, because that version of me had already begun to disappear the moment I decided to stop accepting a place that was never truly mine. The following days did not bring any dramatic confrontations, no raised voices or unexpected visits, just a series of quiet changes that unfolded exactly as they needed to. I kept my routine the same on the surface: morning coffee, light breakfast, a short walk down the block, but underneath that calm, I was moving with purpose. Every call I made, every document I reviewed, every signature I placed carried intention, not urgency, not panic, just a steady progression forward. Harold sent over updated summaries of the accounts and structures we had discussed, simplified in a way that allowed me to see the full picture without distraction. And for the first time, I understood not only what existed, but how it connected, how one decision affected another, how access could be granted or quietly removed without conflict. I spent hours at the desk in the study, reading through everything slowly, making notes in the margins, asking follow-up questions when something was unclear, and each answer brought a little more clarity, a little more distance from the version of myself who had once signed papers without asking what they meant. One afternoon, I received a notification from the bank confirming that certain authorizations had been updated. Nothing extreme, nothing that would raise immediate concern, just small adjustments, access points that no longer extended as freely as they once had. I imagined Daniel and Olivia continuing their plans, unaware that the foundation they believed was stable had begun to shift in ways they could not yet see, and I did not rush that realization. I let it take its time, because this was not about creating a scene. It was about restoring balance. Later that week, I met with the financial advisor Harold had recommended, a younger woman named Claire who spoke with precision and respect, never assuming, always explaining. She reviewed my situation carefully, confirming what I already suspected, that my position was not dependent on anyone else's approval, that I had more control than I had ever exercised, and that control, when used quietly, was often the most effective kind. We discussed options, not drastic moves, but strategic ones, adjustments that would protect what was mine without inviting unnecessary attention. And I left that meeting with a folder of neatly organized documents and a sense of direction that felt both new and long overdue. When I returned home, I placed the folder beside the lockbox, aligning them carefully, as if putting everything back into order externally helped reinforce the order I now felt internally. That evening, as the light outside softened and the house settled into its familiar stillness, my phone buzzed for the first time since the wedding. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I simply looked at it, not with anticipation, not with resentment, just observation. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, my voice steady when I finally spoke. And as he began to talk, offering a version of explanation that felt rehearsed and incomplete, I realized something quietly important. I was no longer listening to him the way I used to, searching for reassurance or meaning between his words. I was hearing him clearly, without attachment, without the need to soften what he was saying, and that clarity made all the difference, because for the first time, the conversation was not about understanding him. It was about deciding how much of myself I was willing to give in return, and that decision, I already knew, had changed. Daniel spoke for a long time, longer than necessary, filling the space with explanations that circled around the truth without ever quite reaching it. He said it was a misunderstanding, that Olivia had a strange sense of humor, that things had gotten out of hand, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, as if he had practiced saying these words until they sounded reasonable even to himself. I let him finish without interrupting, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, tracing the grain of the wood the way I used to when I was thinking. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it sit between us, steady and unbroken, until it became clear that I was not going to rescue him from it. You laughed, I said simply, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what had been. There was a brief hesitation on the other end, the kind that reveals more than any explanation. And then he began again, softer this time, saying he did not know how to react, that he did not want to make a scene, that it was supposed to be a happy day. I listened, but I did not absorb it the way I once would have, trying to understand, trying to excuse. Instead, I heard it as it was, a choice, quiet, but deliberate. When I finally spoke again, my voice remained calm, unchanged. It was a happy day, I said, just not for me. Another pause followed, longer this time, and I could almost feel him searching for something to say that would shift the weight of that sentence. But there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to soften, because the truth, once spoken plainly, does not leave much room for negotiation. He asked if we could talk in person, suggested coming by the house, and for a moment, I considered how easily I would have agreed before, how quickly I would have rearranged my day, prepared coffee, created space for a conversation that would likely end the same way it always had, with me accepting less than I deserved in the name of keeping peace. But that pattern no longer fit, not after everything I now understood, not today. I said, the words steady, final without being harsh. I have things to take care of. He sounded surprised, not offended, just unprepared for that kind of answer, as if he had not considered that my time, my attention, might no longer be automatically available to him. We ended the call shortly after. No resolution, no dramatic conclusion, just a quiet shift that neither of us fully addressed. I placed the phone down and sat there for a moment, noticing again how calm I felt. Not relieved, not satisfied, just certain. Later that afternoon, I received an email confirmation from the bank regarding additional updates, routine on the surface, but significant in what they represented, permissions adjusted, access refined. Everything moving exactly as it should. I did not rush to check it immediately. I finished what I was doing first, then reviewed it carefully, line by line, making sure everything aligned with what had been discussed. And as I closed the document, I realized that the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming was no longer abstract. It was measurable, in decisions made, in boundaries set, in the absence of hesitation where it once defined me. Outside, the light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the room, and I stood by the window for a moment, watching as the day settled into evening, knowing that somewhere, Daniel and Olivia were continuing their lives as if nothing had changed, unaware that the quiet adjustments already in motion would soon make themselves known, not loudly, not all at once, but in ways that could not be ignored. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to prepare for their reaction, because whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations. It would be shaped by mine. The changes did not announce themselves right away. There were no sudden phone calls filled with panic, no immediate confrontations, just small disruptions that began to surface one by one, like quiet signals that something underneath had shifted. A few days later, my phone rang again, this time earlier in the morning, Daniel's name appearing with a sense of urgency that had not been there before. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I no longer felt the need to respond instantly. When I picked up, his tone was different, tighter, less controlled. He asked if I had made any changes to the accounts, the question carefully phrased, but the concern beneath it unmistakable. I did not answer right away. Instead, I walked slowly to the window, looking out at the street as a car passed by, its movement steady and uninterrupted. I reviewed what belongs to me, I said, my voice even, measured, and for a moment, there was silence on the other end, not confusion this time, but realization. He tried to explain again, to soften the situation, saying they had been planning things, that certain decisions had already been set in motion, that it would be complicated if access changed now. I listened, but the words no longer carried the same weight they once did, because what he described as complication, I now understood as assumption. An assumption does not hold authority unless it is allowed to. Plans can be adjusted. I replied, simply, not dismissive, not confrontational, just factual. He exhaled, a quiet sound that spoke more than his words. And then he mentioned Olivia, saying she was confused, that she did not understand why things were suddenly different. And I almost smiled, not out of satisfaction, but recognition. Because confusion is what happens when someone realizes control was never truly theirs. I did not mention the reception, did not revisit the moment they had both chosen to treat lightly, because this was no longer about that single incident. It was about everything that had followed, everything that had been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly taken for granted. After the call ended, I set my phone down and returned to the table, where the documents were still neatly arranged. I reviewed them again, not because I doubted anything, but because clarity, once gained, is something you learn to maintain. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Claire confirming that additional safeguards had been put in place, routine adjustments, she called them, but I understood what they meant, boundaries, defined and respected. I read through the details carefully, noting how each piece fit into the larger structure, how access now required acknowledgement, how decisions now required consent, not assumed compliance. And as I closed the file, I realized that what had once been invisible to me was now fully in view. Not overwhelming, not intimidating, just clear, outside. The light had shifted again, the soft gold of late afternoon stretching across the room, and I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, knowing that somewhere, Daniel and Olivia were beginning to feel the effects of something they could not yet fully explain. Small delays, unexpected restrictions, questions from institutions they had never needed to answer before. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, but enough to disrupt the certainty they had carried so easily. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to anticipate their next move, because whatever came next would not be something I reacted to. It would be something I allowed or declined. And that distinction, quiet as it was, had changed the balance entirely. It was 3 days later when Daniel showed up at the house without calling first. I saw his car pull into the driveway through the front window, the familiar shape of it slowing to a stop in a way that told me he had not come casually. I did not rush to open the door. I finished placing the dishes in the sink, dried my hands carefully, and only then walked to the entrance. When I opened it, he was already standing there, shoulders slightly tense, his expression caught somewhere between frustration and something he could not quite name. "We need to talk," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. I stepped aside to let him in without responding, and he walked past me into the living room, glancing around as if expecting something to feel different. Even though everything looked exactly the same, he began speaking before he even sat down, words coming faster now, less controlled than they had been on the phone. He talked about the accounts, about delays, about calls from the bank asking for confirmations he had never needed to provide before, about plans that were now on hold because access had changed without warning. I listened from across the room, standing near the window, my posture relaxed, my attention steady. When he paused, waiting for me to explain, I did not offer him the comfort of confusion or apology. "Nothing changed without reason," I said, and the simplicity of that sentence seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Mom, this affects everything," he said, and I noticed the word everything, how easily it came to him, as if everything had always included me without question, even when it had not. I walked slowly to the chair across from him and sat down, not hurried, not defensive, just present. "It affects what you assumed was yours," I replied, my voice calm, not raised, not sharp, just clear. He looked at me then, really, looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something shift in his expression, not anger, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have misunderstood a situation entirely. He started to speak again, then stopped, as if searching for a different approach, a better angle. But there was none left, not now, not after everything had already been set in motion. "Olivia is upset," he said finally, and I held his gaze, steady, unchanged. "She thought we were all on the same page." I almost smiled at that, not out of mockery, but because of how familiar that phrase sounded, how often it had been used to move forward without actually including me. "We were not," I said, simply, and the room fell quiet after that, the the kind of quiet that does not ask to be filled, but insists on being acknowledged. He leaned back slightly, the tension in his shoulders shifting into something else, something less certain. And for the first time since he had arrived, he did not try to control the direction of the conversation. He just sat there, absorbing what was in front of him. And I realized then that this was the moment, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive, where the balance had changed in a way that could not be undone. Because he was no longer speaking to the version of me who would adjust, who would smooth things over, who would accept discomfort to preserve the appearance of harmony. He was speaking to someone who understood exactly where she stood, and more importantly, what she was no longer willing to give away. And as he sat there, searching for something to say that would restore what he had lost, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by his expectations, but by my silence, my clarity, and the choices I had already made.